Welcome back to the program. You can join the conversation at hashtag AM Agenda on Twitter, and you can follow me too on Twitter at Kieran_Gilbert. Now let's get to our panel now. Panel of politicians: Liberal MP Paul Fletcher in Sydney, and in Adelaide we have Labor MP Nick Champion. Gentlemen, good morning to you both. Nick, calls for the Prime Minister to intervene in the Qantas dispute. Has it got to the point where that needs to happen? 500 flights have been cancelled. It's been enormously damaging. Does the government have to do something?
Well, both parties should get back around the negotiating table and negotiate. That's the principle in our industrial relations system, that both sides should negotiate in good faith. I think both sides should, take a cold shower, get back round the bargaining table and actually negotiate, rather than being out there in the public gaze and inconveniencing the public. I mean, really what we need is for Qantas and the unions to negotiate in good faith. I think if that happens, they'll protect Australian jobs, protect Australian consumers, and it'll cease to be an issue. On the issue of intervention...
Does this not show that the system has been weakened under the Labor government?
Well, no, we still had industrial action under John Howard. There were very big disputes under John Howard in the past, and there's been disputes in this country for 100 years. Occasionally that happens. But what we need, I think, is just a bit of common sense for both sides to take a cold shower, get back to the bargaining table, stop, seeking public attention, and negotiate with each other. And both sides, if they think that there's merit to it, can apply to Fair Work Australia for orders for intervention. It's not up to the Prime Minister, it's up to the parties to apply for those orders to the independent umpire, which is Fair Work Australia.
Yeah, Paul, that's fair enough, isn't it, to allow the commercial dispute to be resolved by the parties as opposed to the government intervening whenever there's a stoush like this?
Well, Kieran, Nick seems to be living in some kind of alternative reality. Everybody knows that since Labor got into power and since we've had this Orwellian Fair Work Australia, that we are rapidly returning to the bad old days of Australia being governed by the unions and customers and consumers in any industry, in any sector, subject to the risk that services will be interrupted. What we are seeing is thousands of Australians having their travel plans interrupted on what appears to be a near daily basis at the moment. And what's been reported in the press this morning is a major travel agency business making the point this is incredibly disruptive to consumers and to business, and if this government were responsible, they would be attaching an urgent priority to getting this problem fixed.
Paul, that's 100% right. Of course, it's very disruptive and it's damaging, but it's easy for the coalition to use tough language and to blame the government, but the coalition doesn't actually have an industrial relations policy right now, and there's all sorts of fights within your own side as to what you should do. So how much credibility should we give attacks from the coalition when, you've got former Treasurer Costello and Peter Reith and others urging Mr Abbott to be tougher on IR, and yet he doesn't want to go anywhere near it because of the fear of reigniting the Work Choices campaign?
Kieran, this isn't about politics. This is about the experiences of consumers, of ordinary Australians who are suffering at the hands of militant unions and at the hands of a government which seems happy to let the unions reassert a sort of control over the Australian economy which we haven't seen since the 1970s. And so, it is very concerning that we have the consequences of the system that has been introduced being played out here, and it's understandable that Australians are getting very, very frustrated, and we really ought to see this Prime Minister giving this a higher attention. Unfortunately, one of the problems is that because her own authority has been so corroded, because there's so much internal focus within the Labor Party about who the next Prime Minister is going to be when she inevitably collapses, unfortunately she doesn't seem to have the authority or the capacity to deal with this issue or indeed any of the other pressing issues facing Australia.
And Nick Champion, what do you put to some of those suggestions, including the last one there, that the Prime Minister is distracted with her own issues in terms of Labor internal politics and unable to address issues of national importance like this one, which is causing a headache for so many people around the country?
Well, look, it's a nonsense, Karen. I mean, look, we had the Tri-Star dispute under John Howard, which held up the automotive industry for quite some time. I had people in my electorate off work as a result of that dispute during John Howard's era. These disputes come and go as employers and unions negotiate. And Paul's rhetoric about militant unions really doesn't serve the public interest. We've got a company here and a union here who aren't negotiating, and they need to get back around the negotiating table. They need to sort of, take a cold shower, get back to the negotiating table and negotiate in good faith to protect Australian jobs. Just sort of simply beating up on unions and having this rhetoric in place of having a policy is not really good enough. And the reason why the Liberal Party don't have a policy is they don't have the courage to own up to the fact that they all believe in work choices. And so what we get is this silly rhetoric about the 1970s and militant unions and rah, and no policy, and really, I think, quite foolish calls for Prime Ministers to go around the country intervening in every commercial dispute, every industrial relations dispute that's going.
Well, you've both had a decent crack at that. I do want to look at a few other issues. Paul Fletcher, on the issue of Tony Abbott's comments in relation to China and the free trade agreement, suggesting that it's problematic. That China was one of the more problematic deals because there are questions to what extent China is a market economy. This is a report in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age this morning. You heard what Senator Joyce had to say. What do you make of the comments? Does your leadership need to be a bit more cautious about what they say, given China is of such great import to our economy, the largest trading partner?
Well, first of all, I don't think any of us should be attracted to the suggestion that in some way we ought to be constraining the vigour of the discussion within Australia about the policy options for fear of in some way causing offence to other governments. We are a robust democracy and we have robust internal discussion. Secondly, the point that Tony was making was we are strong supporters of free trade, we are strong supporters of trade agreements if they can be negotiated in ways that serve Australia's national interest. Tony was making the pragmatic point that it is an attractive proposition to be looking at doing a fair trade, a trade deal with Japan, and that if you were weighing up where do you allocate your priorities first to, as between Japan and China, there are some good arguments for going with Japan first. But the central point is this: we are strong supporters of free trade, and we'll look at the merits of a trade deal with Japan, we'll look at the merits of a trade deal with China, and frankly the suggestion in the press this morning that in some way Tony's comments were in any way likely to cause alarm in Beijing just strikes me as frankly a bit overexcited.
Nick Champion, isn't it fair enough for a robust public discourse on trade and everything else?
Well, nobody's against robust public discourse, but this was an immensely stupid thing to say. Tony Abbott seems, absolutely convinced that he should cut off his nose to spite the nation's face. Every other country on the earth is trying to get into the Chinese market and sell to the Chinese middle class, this emerging economy. And Tony Abbott's the only person around the world who doesn't want to do that. He wants to sort of play these, I think, rather silly games with our nation's interests, with our trade deals. We should be trying to do a trade deal with both China and Japan because it's in this country's interest. We shouldn't be playing, I think, pretty low-grade politics with the nation's economic future. It's in our interest to trade with China, it's in our interest to trade with Japan, and we gain great benefits. Australian workers gain higher incomes and better opportunities out of that trade. So it's really a stupid, damaging thing, I think, a damaging thought bubble, and just more evidence that Tony Abbott really isn't fit to be Prime Minister, that he'll,
all right.
Karen, can I just jump
run around the place saying
absolutely. I want to give you a right of response there, Paul Fletcher, because some fairly strong language used by Nick Champion. First of all, respond to that, and then secondly, do you think there's any argument that the comments need to be clarified by Julie Bishop or someone within the coalition just to smooth over any issues that might be there?
No, I don't, and I'm just going to disregard the sort of ritualistic attack on Tony Abbott. Nick's got the normal Labor disease that they can't complete a sentence without using the words Tony Abbott. The substantive point I wanted to make was this. I am pleased that Nick has stated this morning his support for free trade, and that is something that we support in the coalition as well. And let's focus on some positives here. There is strong support across parties in Canberra for free trade because it serves the interests of Australians.
So you don't think there's any clarification that might be sought from the Chinese on this? That the fact that, you know, Mr. Abbott said in this interview that Japan would be a greater priority, that, you know, that wouldn't be seen as insensitive or maybe raise a few eyebrows as the Fairfax press is suggesting this morning?
Well, again, I think what's been stated in the press this morning is a remarkable overreaction. The key points are we are strong supporters of free trade, we're strong supporters of trade with Japan, strong supporters of trade with China, and interested in doing deals with both.
All right, let's just
Kieran,
quickly, we've only got 2 minutes left, but Nick,
Kieran,
sorry mate, you did have a fair go on that. I want to move on.
When Paul's responding like that.
All right, let's move on. Asylum seekers, and just quickly, this is just so predictable, this argument at the moment. Both sides pointing fingers at each other. Nick, this is going to do the government no good at all, is it? This is just a government... if the electorate is not going to give the government any credit for blaming the coalition on this.
Well, let's forget politics. It's not in the nation's interest to have this situation. It's in the nation's interest for a government, an executive government, to be able to pursue its policies, its immigration policies, and be able to pursue offshore processing. The government's legislation allows either Nauru or Malaysia, allows the Liberals to pursue their policy, and Tony Abbott has cut off his nose yet again to spite his face in rejecting this legislation. And it's a simple fix, Kieran. They should just come into the Parliament, vote for our legislation, and the problem would be resolved.
They would argue that the simple fix is to adopt Nauru, but anyway, I'll just give Paul a quick chat. Paul, we're almost out of time. If you can just respond quickly on that.
Well, Kieran, the quick fix would be to adopt our amendment, which would permit going to third countries which are signatories to the refugee,
Somalia and Iran,
which are signatories to the Refugee Convention. We've had a consistent policy on this. This government's got excuse after excuse. They're like the kid which didn't prepare for the test and then blames the fact that they failed the test on the fact that they couldn't copy from the kid next to them. It's just extraordinary. We've got a consistent record, and we've demonstrated a good track record on this.
Gentlemen, thanks for the chat this morning. It's been good to have you both on AM Agenda. We'll see you both very shortly, and we're standing by to take you live to a news conference with Prime Minister Julia Gillard. She's in Queanbeyan, just outside